And ooh, wow, I feel very powerful now. We're back. This is very exciting. I want a microphone everywhere I go. So it was pointed out to me that the first author, we may want to recognize her. Rosemary, are you in the house? Thank you. You're such a good audience, too. We're all pitching in. It's like a community event tonight. I love it. Okay, so now on with the show. Please welcome to the stage Janis Stevens to read Alberta Nassi's essay, Unanswered. I'm testing this. Can you hear me? Yes. Yeah? Okay. Kellie, is this on? It's very subtle. All right. Okay. I feel like I have to stand over here, but I don't want to. Okay. This essay was first published in Tablet magazine on June 13th, 2023, under the title, My Mother and Me, by Alberta Nassi. According to Jewish law, there is a religious, ethical, and legal obligation to rescue others. The legal and biblical scholar Aaron Kirschenbaum writes about the tragic and much-studied death of Kitty Genovese, who was murdered in Queens in 1964. Over 38 neighbors heard her screams, but never intervened. He draws on Maimonides, who quotes Leviticus 19:16, "Neither shalt thou stand idly by the blood of thy neighbor." The transgression is pivotal. The loss of a single Israelite is tantamount to destroying the world. When one dies, all die. When one survives, all survive. More complicated is whether bystanders are duty-bound to rescue one in peril when such action puts their life in danger. Is self-sacrifice obligatory? Kirschenbaum claims no such duty exists when the danger is mortal. Doctors, however, must attend to patients even when their own lives hang in the balance. But what if the person whose life is endangered is not your patient, but your mother? In the 1980s, I was the clinical director of a day hospital at UC Davis for patients with borderline personality disorder. It was the heyday of this psychiatric classification, which eventually became a wastebasket diagnosis. Borderline personality referred to people with mood instability, intense anger, impulsive and self-damaging behavior, and unstable relationships. They were not strangers to substance abuse, self-mutilation, suicide attempts, and transient psychosis. Our program was known as the Therapeutic Community. Housed in trailers, the site was once a juvenile detention center, an irony not lost on the adult patients who were our charge. The walls were a colorless greige, a tone designers would later emulate, but then felt more like a cold surround, exposing the shrinking resources of a university-run, county-funded psychiatric program in Sacramento. In April 1984, the week after turning 31 and burying my mother, my birth date and her yurt site forever entwined, I resumed my place at the head of the community meeting. As I settled myself on a vinyl stack chair, a pall enveloped the group. They were waiting. Kathy, who was turbulent and spunky, broke the silence. "Are you okay?" "I'm okay," I said. But I was not okay. I was anything but okay. I lied about the cause of my mother's death. I told my colleagues she suffered a heart attack. I did not reveal she had been given the same diagnosis as the patients I treated, borderline personality disorder. Or dare to admit I could not save my own mother, even though I had just published a book chapter about how to manage such patients. No one under my care had died at their own hand. Yet, I ignored the signs of impending death in the woman who gave me life. I bundled up my rage, guilt, shame, and sense of fraudulence. It would take much longer for the sadness to be unveiled. I would not reveal this to them. I would barely reveal this to myself. We abided by an unspoken contract between patient and doctor that any drama will be the patient's, not the other way around. I braced myself. I felt awkward being the focus of the group rather than their leader who observes and comments on the group members and their process. I was suited up emotionally and in my dress as if the assuredness of a tweed blazer and pencil skirt could override my mother's decompensation and ward off my own. I was a newly minted psychologist, and the psychiatry department had put its trust in me as the only woman, the only psychologist, and the youngest among the clinical directors. I had taken a crash course in theories pertaining to these patients. It would be a clinical trial by fire. Already harrowing developments included a patient who tried to run over her therapist in a car when the patient became convinced the clinician was her feared mother. I may not have run over my mother, but I failed to rescue her. I became an unwitting accomplice in her death. The year before, in the months leading up to my wedding, Auntie Annie, my mother's sister-in-law, who lived over the canyon from my mother in Beverly Hills, phoned unexpectedly. "Alberta, I have to talk to you about your mother. She's not doing well. She's not making a life for herself. I think she needs to move to Sacramento to be closer to you." A pause in which my stomach fell as if punctured. I was about to marry the man I loved, thriving in a career I felt passionate about, and finally free of my mother's tyranny. "Oh, Auntie Annie, for the first time in my life, I'm happy. She'll spoil it." Another pause, this one hers. "What can I say? She won't last much beyond your wedding." Annie had known firsthand the accelerating downward spiral of my mother's despair, but she had known little about the chaos behind closed doors, my mother's alcohol binges, rages and threats, paranoia and stalking behavior, operatic screaming that occasionally brought neighbors running. Less still did Annie know about my desperate childhood when I felt trapped by an unhinged mother who distorted reality. After my father's sudden death, she sold our GI tract home and moved to a one-bedroom apartment with stark white walls and popcorn ceilings. My mother tried to convert me to her catastrophic thinking by falsely claiming we had only $1,000 to live on for the entire year. I was barely 9. It sounded like more money than I could imagine. But her frightful voice suggested otherwise. I was old enough to register her worry, but too young to discern that this tangible lie from a widow collecting multiple death benefits and book royalties revealed more about her depleting inner reserves than her pocketbook. My father's death compressed our lives, and my mother, an identical twin, merged them. She covered our single beds with a king-sized white nubby bedspread folded into one in much the same way monozygotic twins cohabit a single egg. She fostered symbiosis by making me her companion, sharing inappropriate confidences, torpedoing my autonomy, and upholding perfectionistic standards. Her instability manifested in drunken blackouts on vacation, which I kept secret. Whimsical purchases like a banana-colored Pontiac bought in a morning, and a facelift at 46, half expecting the surgeon's knife to excise misery as well as wrinkles. I felt both suffocated and responsible. Despite her volatility, I loved and needed my mother. So I became the ballast. I supported her misguided efforts to feel whole. When she waffled about purchasing Wallace Grand Baroque sterling silver or 9mm pearls, I encouraged her. Unless her happiness was assured, I wouldn't be free to find my own. But beneath my straight-A student body president persona, I often felt close to the edge myself and flirted with overdoses of aspirin beginning in the 5th grade. Nor did Annie know about my mother's frenzied calls to my job, berating me to department secretaries. Would she show up at my office if we actually lived in the same town? All my aunt could see was that I'd slipped away, abandoned my mother in her suffering, failed as a daughter. I resented Annie for puncturing my happiness without understanding she was witnessing my mother's deterioration firsthand. In spite of her psychiatric illness and compounding losses, my mother was always a force. Her maiden name was Stone. And that's how I always thought of her. Annie's caveat gnawed at my guilt, but I consigned the conversation to another overreach of my mother's manipulation. This time, I would not be thrown out of the lifeboat. On President's Day weekend in 1984, the month before she died, my mother flew to Sacramento to celebrate her 68th birthday. My husband, Steve, and I waited at the airport reception area, becoming increasingly concerned when she was not among the passengers deplaning. We scanned the crowd looking for a petite, unnaturally blonde senior with oversized glasses and monochromatic mauve pantsuit. On the verge of inquiring, we saw my mother being escorted in a wheelchair by airport security. Before I could register alarm, my mother put her index finger to her lips to silence me. She had no physical disability requiring any assistance. Once out of the earshot of personnel, my mother triumphed over her invention of a heart ailment to garner special attention and avoid the long walk from the gate. From the unsuspecting, she sought compensation for her pain and anguish. Steve and I shook our heads. My mother reveled in riding shotgun in Steve's sports car on the ride home while I scrunched into the back seat. Much as he resented her dependency and intrusiveness, Steve appreciated her razor's edge intellect and worldliness, which sharply contrasted with his own mother's provincialism. My mother admired and fully comprehended the scope of Steve's achievements as an academic psychologist. To his chagrin, she also basked in the status of introducing him to her friends as Doctor. That night, I witnessed my mother's uncharacteristic insecurity when she called me into the kitchen to confer about the browning of her signature fried rice, something she'd been cooking for most of her life. "Do the rice and onions have enough color?" she asked. I could never discern whether she really needed reassurance or whether, like the airport caper, she sought attention and succorance. The next day, we drove to Napa in my vintage BMW coupe. The panorama of lush hills, mustard blooms, and grapevine corridors heralded our arrival at Auberge de Soleil, renowned for its 180-degree view of the valley and Michael Taylor design as much as its food. The balance of elegance and rustic was reflected on every table with the heavy ochre and orange tablecloths set with a single jonquil and eucalyptus in a black vase, a wire mesh candle holder, and salt and pepper shakers on a slab of granite. Temporarily transported to Provence, we were there to celebrate my mother in style. There's a photo taken of the two of us at my wedding 4 months earlier, before we descended the grand staircase of the Flood Mansion in San Francisco to meet Steve under the shelter of the lily-trimmed chuppah. I was smiling in my Victorian-style gown with violets adorning my curls and gazing at her, draped in burgundy organza, with cascading orchids pinned to her dress. I whispered, "We did it. We made it." Now, in these lavish surroundings of the Napa Valley, I relived the same emotion. We were not only celebrating my mother's birthday, we were marking just how far we had traveled from those uncertain days following my father's death and the austerity of that one-bedroom apartment. As my mother prepared to return to LA after our most felicitous visit to date, she let out, I could see myself living here. Every fiber bristled as I waited for the conciliatory atmosphere to become combative. "I'm not sure that would work," I said, hoping the topic would die with my non-committal response. Abetted by regular doses of lithium, my mother had become easier to be around, but she had tried moving therapy before. She had relocated to southern Florida on 2 separate occasions to be closer to her twin sister. Each move failed, the last attempt resulting in my mother's first of 2 psychiatric hospitalizations. Still, I went so far as to say to Steve after she left, maybe it could work. But over the next month, she would stop using and start stockpiling her lithium. Reminders to take her medication on alternate days were faithfully recorded in her Universal Savings Bank calendar, beginning with January 2nd, 1984. By March 9, 2 weeks after her visit and 2 weeks before her death, the word pill no longer appeared. The phone rang mercilessly the night of March 21st. Roused but not completely conscious, I clung to the sanctity of sleep. Nothing quelled her plaintive cries. Like the howls of an inconsolable infant, she became more insistent. By the time I arose, the caller had hung up. I stared into the little black holes of the receiver. The caller's identity was clear before I answered. Those unremitting rings were her trademark. They followed me for most of my life. Whenever a phone rang, I startled. With Pavlovian predictability, I deployed my vigilance at the first sound of my mother's distress signal. Even after I left home and traveled to remote locations, I half expected to hear her voice at the end of a stranger's receiver on a farm in Santa Cruz, a Taco Bell in Cuernavaca, or a taberna in Skiros. I suspect she knew I avoided her calls. I felt desperate to maintain distance in a relationship that loomed too large for both of us, but my resistance only fueled her perseverance. Friends fielded my mother's inquiries regarding my whereabouts and often got an earful about my grievous faults. As an identical twin living on a separate coast from her sister and widowed for too long, my mother never felt whole without the presence of another. As her sole child to survive childbirth, one sister stillborn and another dead after 38 hours, I was the only other. That was the last time her call would jolt me out of sleep. The following afternoon, I opened the Tudor oak door to collect our mail from the chute inside my house. Spring light gleamed through the leaded glass window and illuminated catalogs and ads cluttering the rustic tile entryway. Gathering the rest in haste, I walked upstairs to my desk and shuffled through a MasterCard statement, a city utility bill, a Charles Schwab trade confirmation, and the Smithsonian magazine, among assorted junk mail, mindlessly sorting them into piles. Her letter was not the first in the stack, but I recognized the handwriting instantly. My stomach seized, anticipating a reprimand. For what? Who knew? I never knew. An unforeseen slight I'd committed, keeping my mother placated required constant surveillance. Often I failed, as simple as that. I tore open the lined envelope and unfolded the sheet of stationery. A waft of her Estee Lauder Youth Dew fragrance filled the air. By the time you receive this letter, I'll be gone. I don't remember whether I read to the end. I slumped back in my chair and my heartbeat slowed to a crawl. The painted surfaces of my home office, not quite the color of candlelight, stared back at me. Original crown moldings, double-hung windows. My eyes roved the land park cottages peeking in through the dormer. Once a comfort, these features were now material witnesses, inert and cold. 40 years have passed. Now I am staring down the decade when both my mother and her mother ended their lives. My grandmother leaped to death from the ledge of her Brooklyn apartment at the age of 67, her slippers placed neatly beneath the windowsill. After turning 68, my mother swallowed a fatal dose of lithium as the walls of her one-bedroom apartment closed in on her. At 70, am I living on borrowed time? But my father's mother, my grandmother Leona, lived well into her 90s, despite similar travails. She had lost her husband, my grandfather, from a massive coronary when he was only 49. Left with 3 children during the Depression, she found solace in Judaism, family, barecas, Ladino music, and a second marriage. She emigrated from Istanbul and could trace her family lineage back to Doña Gracia Nassi, that most stalwart of widows, who secured a homeland for Sephardim in Istanbul during the Spanish Inquisition. I wear Leona's Turkish gold coin, minted in 1923 after the fall of the Ottoman Empire, around my neck. It is my amulet. My work as a psychologist enriches my life and furnishes me with a way of giving and getting meaning. I have also spent years on the other side of the couch, but mostly I have scaffolded my life with family and friends and have known the safety and consolation of an intimate relationship over half my lifetime. I am not the poster child for suicide loss survival. We can never know how much heartbreak propels someone to jump or ingest a fistful of pills. By sharing my story, not keeping it secret, I hope to break the cycle for myself and the people I love. Kirschenbaum points out that the obligation to rescue a person attempting suicide has been disputed among rabbinic authorities for the past 4 centuries. But I am not just a bystander. Honor thy father and thy mother. For me, there is no dispute. Left with a dial tone, I did not save my mother. I chose to save myself. She left me desperate for the conversation we would never have. Once flooded by her words, now by her silence. She was everywhere. She was nowhere.